Greetings everyone. Today we'll talk about the chapter Pollination and Fertilization. In this chapter, we'll learn about what is pollination, how it takes place, what are the two different types of pollination, and in these two different types, what are the advantages and disadvantages. We'll also know that about the agents that help in these two types of pollination. Now, we'll also know at the end of the chapter about how fertilization in plants take place. So let us start with pollination. If you recall the previous chapter, we had learned there that flower, out of all its various parts, it has two reproductive structures as well. One is known as androecium, the male reproductive structure. Another is gynoecium, the female reproductive structure. So these are the two reproductive structures that participate in the process pollination. Or to be more specific, if we talk about the male organ, one single male organ known as the stamen, it has a part known as anther, which consists of pollen, or rather pollen grains. These pollen grains and the stigma of the female part pistil participate in pollination. It is a very simple process of transference of pollen grains to the stigma. This transference is known as pollination, and it basically may take place in three ways. The first one, known as autogamy. If you look at this figure and imagine these two as two different plants with flowers drawn on it, then let us imagine this as the stamen of this flower and this as the stigma. When the pollen grains present on the stamen of a flower falls on the stigma of the same flower, we call this type of pollination as autogamy. So this is the first type of autogamy. Auto means self. So in this kind of pollination, the flower is the stigma of the flower is pollinated by the anther or the pollen grain of itself. Okay, so this is autogamy. Let us come to this plant. If the stamen of this flower falls on the stigma of this flower, both the flowers are of the same plant. So when in the same plant two different flowers are participating in the process of pollination, this kind of pollination will be known as geitonogamy. And if the pollen grain from this plant falls on the stigma of this plant, then, or rather this flower, then we will call it allogamy. So let us quickly recap the three types. In case of a bisexual flower, when the stamen, or rather the pollen grains, fall on the stigma of the same flower, then we call it autogamy. In case of this plant, where both the flowers are present which participate in pollination, and the pollen grain of one flower falls on the stigma of another flower but of the same plant, then we call it geitonogamy. And when one flower, or rather the pollen grain of one flower, falls on the stigma of another flower from a different plant, not of the same plant, of a different plant, then we call it allogamy. Okay, so for autogamy, the flower needs to be a bisexual flower. For allogamy, it can take place with the help of wind, insects, water or other agents. But autogamy does not need any such agents. It does not need any, insects may participate in this kind of pollination, wind, water can participate, but there is no specific need of such. Anyways, so coming back to the book, the figure 5.1 summarizes the three different ways in which pollination can take place. Now, let us see what's given next. It says that nature has so designed that only the pollen of the same species of plant will survive and grow further to continue the processes for reproduction, and the rest of the types of pollen will fail to germinate and perish. Why this thing is needed in the text? It is so because I have drawn a diagram to make believe these three different processes that are taking place. The book has also drawn a diagram like this, but that doesn't mean that in the nature only the similar types of plants grow in a certain place. There are varieties of plants growing in one particular place. So when this transfer of pollen grain is taking place, many things might happen. Rose pollen grains may fall on hibiscus plant's stigma. Your pollen grains from a mango flower may fall on pollen grains of rose. So many things can happen. So if that takes place, then, and if fertilization takes place in every such case, then we will be getting hybrids every now and then. So for that not to happen, so that a particular species can give rise to its offspring, nature has designed it in such a way that even if the pollen grains of a different species falls on a particular flower, that pollen grain will not be able to grow further. Okay, so let us start with the two different kinds of pollination. The two different kinds of pollination that we will learn today is self-pollination and cross-pollination. Today I'll be just giving you an intro of what self-pollination is and what cross-pollination is. The next day we'll discuss this in detail. So self-pollination is obviously the transfer of pollen. So what happens here? The pollen transfers from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, or to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. That means we had learnt about autogamy and geitonogamy. So in autogamy and geitonogamy, these two types of pollination, they fall under the process of self-pollination. So basically in self-pollination, same flower has to be there for it to take place, or even if a different flower is there which is participating in pollination, they need to belong to the same plant. Then only I can call it self-pollination. Okay, so self-pollination is of two types. One where the pollen grain of the same flower falls on the stigma of the flower, and another type is two different flowers are involved here. The pollen grain of one flower falls on the stigma of another flower, but both the flowers belong to the same plant. So this is geitonogamy, and autogamy and geitonogamy both are types of self-pollination. Coming to cross-pollination, so this transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma takes place of a flower of another plant, but it has to be the same species. So the allogamy part that we learnt previously, That's what cross-pollination is. So in case of cross-pollination, 2 different flowers will be involved, and those 2 flowers will belong to 2 different plants. Not of the same plant, of 2 different plants, and both the plants need to be of the same species. Okay, so this is what cross-pollination is. So that's it for today. Next day we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages, or what are the requirements for self-pollination and cross-pollination to take place. So that's it for today. Thank you.